any questions? Anybody have a question?
Oh, and I didn't answer the fifth question. The fifth question is come to our table here next door, and we'll show you the technology available.
Thanks again, Paul. Our next speaker is Paul Chodak. Chodak, he's the president of Indiana Michigan Power. If you would, please help me welcome Paul.
Well, good morning. I'm Paul Chodak. I'm President and Chief Operating Officer of Indiana Michigan Power. Indiana Michigan Power is a wholly owned subsidiary operating company of American Electric Power. We're located in Northeast Indiana and Southwestern Michigan. AEP is the holding company, and it is in 11 states and basically has 7 operating companies, about 38,000 megawatts of generation, and is pretty much the largest transmission owner in the country. So this is just another graphic of some of the slides we saw before, but I would ask a question. If you looked at that and you were an investor and you were thinking about building a power plant, what would you build? And if you know that it's going to take you 20, 30, 40 years to recoup that investment, what would you invest in? My guess is something other than a power plant. Here's AEP's generating portfolio. You can see the transition between 2013 and 2020. We go from about 23% natural gas up to 33% natural gas, and a likewise decline in coal and lignite. We will be retiring 7,000 megawatts. Of a 38,000 megawatt fleet, we will be retiring 7,000 megawatts, primarily driven by MATS, and that'll occur mostly by mid-2015 and then some as late as 2016. We'll convert some coal to natural gas, but really there'll be no new fossil generation. We're not planning on building any between now and 2020. In fact, if you were to look at Indiana Michigan's integrated resource plan filed with the commissions, our integrated resource plan basically has us adding solar between now and 2032 in small patches, about 700 megawatts of solar. So really no new fossil on the horizon. I think the conversation that we're having is we recognize that there are emission controls, and primarily clean coal is achievable, has been achieved in many, many cases. For American Electric Power, we've actually reduced our SO2 and NOx emissions by 80% and 70% respectively over the last several years. The key is trying to figure out how do we manage CO2, and then what's the cost-benefit analysis associated with that, and where do we need to go? And I'll get to that in a little more detail later in my presentation. If you look here, some of the things that are really impacting the grid today: renewable and distributed generation. Obviously, potentially a disruptive technology. Renewables are challenging because of their intermittency. The regulatory regime around how you recover those costs, if you're recovering costs on a cents per kilowatt hour basis, as is traditional, that doesn't work very well for distributed generation. Energy efficiency and demand response. It's critically important that we maximize and get as much out of energy efficiency and demand response as we can. The challenge is, how do you dispatch that, or how do you plan that? You can see estimates anywhere from, in the EPA's 111D, they're thinking 1.5% per year. Other estimates are more like 0.5% per year, but at the end of the day, it's all dependent on the consumer. Cybersecurity requirements, NERC requirements, those are ratcheting up very considerably, and you can just see the rest of them. But the key is to try and get that balance right. I mean, our job is to serve customers the way they want to be served and to provide them reliable, safe, affordable electricity. That's our job. And it's we've got to factor all these things in and kind of balance that out. So what does the future look like? If you think about what the generation mix is, I would say that it's anywhere from what's on the left to what's on the right. Yeah, all right, it's left and right for you guys as well. Okay. You can see that we could very well, depending on the environmental regulations, the shale gas and what gas prices do, renewable portfolio standards, we could very easily move to where we're basically gas and renewables. And the question is, where along that continuum do we think we're going to wind up? And what is required in order to have a sustainable grid? Key issues impacting where we're trying to go. So dispatchable capacity is threatened. And what I mean by that is, as both speakers earlier said, when you go over and you flip the switch, you want the lights to come on. And that's whether it's windy out or not windy out, or sunny out or not sunny out, or the dispatchable resource that said, yeah, we'll interrupt, does or doesn't interrupt. And capacity markets are not working very well. American Electric Power is part of PJM. PJM's capacity market cleared in 2016 for on the order of about $60, when the cost to have steel in the ground is more like $300 a megawatt day. Obviously, there's not a price signal there that tells you want to invest in generation. Environmental regulations, and it's not so much the stringency of the environmental regulations as it is the uncertainty. Okay. There we go. I hit the right button, good. The other thing that we need to think about is the infrastructure, the ancillary services. I talk to people who have solar panels on their roof, and their assumption is that they're basically energy independent now, and so that if the grid went down, that they'd be all set because they'd just run off their solar panels as long as the sun was out. And that's really not true. Most solar panels are connected directly to the grid, and then they're also feeding off the grid and both going through the same meter. That's why it's net metering. The reality is every time the air conditioner kicks on, they get that surge current, which is what that graphic shows you. You get this surge current, and there's no way that that solar panel installation is going to be able to handle that. To be able to have an installation and really be truly a microgrid at a home would have to handle all these ancillary services, and would have to be a much more substantial installation, much higher capital cost. So all these ancillary services are still coming from the grid. And then the key is, when we talk about our investments, we're talking about very long-term investments. And as I showed you on that graphic, what would you invest in? What's the right decision to make sure that we're there to serve our customers going forward? Reliability and flexibility. So we've been talking about the fact that all capacity is not created equal, right? Demand response will show up or not show up. Wind and solar, it depends on what's going on. Weather-wise, energy storage technology is not there yet. We don't really have cost-effective large-scale storage yet. That may be coming in the next 5 to 10 years, but it's not here today. And at the end of the day, the grid has to be able to handle the most extreme circumstances. And we just had a very serious circumstance in the polar vortex that happened last year. And you can see the graphic here of the peak that occurred, and then here's wind generation and demand response serving that load during that time frame. Okay. And you can see the quote there from SNL Energy. The prices spiked through the roof up to about $1,800 a megawatt hour, when normal prices would be more like $30 to $50 a megawatt hour. We had outages. Basically, we had 20% forced outages among power plants. Natural gas plants couldn't run because there wasn't enough natural gas supply to the plants for several plants. The infrastructure wasn't in place. I can tell you the renewable resources weren't there, and really it was dependent on the backbone, which is really a lot of the dispatchable power. And 89% of the 7,000 megawatts that we have slated for retirement, and really across PJM, was up and running during that polar vortex. And in PJM, they were calling for more power and couldn't get it. And I understand a polar vortex is a very extreme scenario, but that's exactly what we're supposed to be designing our system to handle. right? So that no matter what, when people flip that switch, they can get the power. The time for the power to go out isn't when it's negative 15 degrees outside. Okay, and when we talk about costs, you can see that existing coal plants, and we kind of compare these costs, and when we run these models, we don't really differentiate between the value of that capacity. And when we talk about these costs, we don't differentiate between the value. They just kind of compare them as apples to apples, when in fact they're really apples to oranges. When you look at the PJM capacity value of solar and wind, solar's around 38%, wind's around 18%. You can see that comparing those two things and just in a straight up cost comparison doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If we look to Europe, who arguably are further along than we are down this trajectory, particularly we'll talk about Germany in a minute, their energy policy is hinged on managing carbon with a carbon market and then renewable energy targets. And you can see the issues that are causing there. Carbon prices are currently around $5 a ton. Cost of subsidies is expected to be greater than $16 billion in Germany. And when you look at the German utilities have lost $500 billion in market value. And if you look at that difference in price spread there between the United States and, for example, Germany, you can see what's causing that. I actually spent some time over in Germany because I was very interested to understand what had happened there, how it had happened, and what were some of the things we could learn so that we maybe work our transition a lot more smoothly. Germany has a peak demand of about 85 gigawatts. They have installed nameplate capacity of 185 gigawatts. So think about that. In a PJM market for an 85 gigawatt peak demand, you might have maybe 100 gigawatts installed, okay, with about a 15% reserve margin. So they're significantly overbuilt in capacity. They had subsidies similar to what we have here and feed-in tariffs that were actually a little bit stronger than what we have here. And what you had was farmers building, and still have today, you have farmers building barns out in their field just so they can put solar panels on the roof and sell the power back to the grid. Now, if you're planning a system, the last place you want to put a whole bunch of source is at the end of a long radial line where you just have one line going out to a barn, and then count on that as reliable power to be able to serve your customers. It's a very difficult situation. Germany's average cost right now is about 40 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, that's not totally driven by their renewables policy. They also have value-added tax built into there. But just the surcharge to cover the renewables that they've installed is roughly 10 cents a kilowatt hour. 10 cents a kilowatt hour. That's a little bit more than what my customers pay, residential customers pay for power. So you would basically double their bill to do what Germany did. You can see that, there we go. You can see the subsidies totaled 120 billion since 2002, 86 times the cost of the most recently built coal-fired power plant. The interesting thing of this is that although Germany's gone through all this, you can see the change here, wind, solar, nuclear, you can see the buildup of wind and solar. And that's why I said they got to 185 gigawatts of nameplate capacity. They've mothballed 3,100 megawatts of fossil. And what you have right now is Germany basically generates excess power during the day, a lot of wind power, a lot of solar power. They export it to the other countries in Europe. It's really interesting to see how long the other countries in Europe are going to put up with that, because if you're a utility, at one point they had so much excess generation on a Sunday where demand was low that the price for power on the market was negative $100 a megawatt hour. You had to pay for the privilege of keeping your plant up, basically. So if you're a utility in a neighboring country, and that's what you're seeing because of all the experts from Germany, and then, by the way, at night, when solar goes away, then they are a net importer. And Germany's main issue is that they decided some years ago, it started with Chernobyl, to shut down all their nuclear. And then with the advent of Fukushima, they basically said, all right, by 2022, we're going to get rid of all of our nuclear. And then if you layer on top of that, that they really don't have cost-effective natural gas, then renewables make a lot of sense. But the challenge is that the way they've done it is not particularly cost-effective. Here's the difference in capacity. As you can see, there's solar, but then when you get to days when they have serious demand and the solar's not available, you can see that really that baseload capacity really has to step up. So you have this circumstance where you basically have megawatts of renewables, but you have to have megawatts of baseload capacity to back that up. And it's not necessarily a one-to-one, but in general, you're building way more capacity than you need to. So when we talk about in the future, because we have renewables, it's going to be less expensive, I'm just curious how that model works. Okay. If we switch over to CO2 and change our focus from renewables and just think about CO2, you know, we have seen declining CO2 emissions. You can see there the figure of 21% since 2005, 31% since 2000. We think we'll go down another 5%. So I think we agree that managing CO2 may be something we want to do, but the issue is to make sure we have the right policy. If you look at the U.S. sector in general, it's a general decline in CO2. The question is how fast, on that balance point, how fast do we need to make those CO2 emissions decline versus the cost? When we talk about 111D, we have state-by-state emission targets. The CO2 emission goals, we talked earlier about the 4 building blocks. I'll just give you our 2-second take on that. So heat rate improvement, the building block assumed that we could get 6% heat efficiency improvement in our coal plants. And I'll tell you, if I had coal plants out there where I could get cost-effective 6% improvement in efficiency, that plant manager would probably be out of a job because he should have already made that improvement. Okay, our estimates are more like 1% and not necessarily cost-effective, but we could get about 1%. What couples on top of that is as you ramp down these coal plants, they're really made to come up, they're baseload plants, they're made to come up, run at as high a capacity as they can, and that's where they run most efficiently. When you start cycling them up and down because of redispatching natural gas, as you try and ramp that up to 70%, and you start cycling those coal plants on and off like they do in Germany, where the coal plants have to ramp up at night and shut down during the day, that efficiency gain goes away completely. In fact, you become less efficient because the plants aren't designed to run that way. And that's why in Germany, despite the fact that they've spent all that money and installed all that renewables, their actually CO2 footprint in terms of tons of CO2 emitted per megawatt hour generated has gone up. Let me say that again. The whole intent of renewable energy efficiency policy was to reduce that CO2 footprint. The reality is they've accomplished exactly the opposite because they've shut down a bunch of natural gas plants because they can't run cost effectively, and lignite is much cheaper, and they've built a bunch of lignite plants. So they've actually increased their CO2 emissions. Renewable energy, nuclear energy, we talked about that. Renewables make sense. As I said, in our integrated resource plan for Indiana Michigan Power, we actually add 700 megawatts of renewable over the next 20 years. Energy efficiency makes sense. The question is, how much energy efficiency can you get, and at what cost? You know, at the end of the day, unless we reduce the overall cost, the equation is cents per kilowatt hour. And as the speaker alluded to earlier, if we're not reducing that cents, all we're doing is reducing the kilowatt hours, then we're increasing the rate. So you may use fewer kilowatt hours, but that cost is higher. And depending on whose model you look at, they either say, you know, what's the old expression, we make it up on volume. I don't know if we're going to make it up on volume. Each building block is to be used, and contrary, I think, to what we talked about earlier, and we'll talk about the dates. But yeah, there we go. If you look at those targets, you need to hit these 2020 targets by 2020, or, as the speaker alluded to earlier, Over this time frame, you're behind, so you'll actually have to do more by 2030. So instead of a 45% reduction, if they don't achieve a 37% reduction by 2020, they have to have higher than a 45% reduction by 2030. The way you can read that in is it's much more expensive, right? The sooner you start complying, the lower cost your overall program is. So to say that the compliance really, you have 15 years to comply, that's not really true, because you start paying a pretty serious price if you're not in compliance with this by 2020. So then let's walk through that timeline. We're talking about states basically being able to generate the final rule 2015, then states generate their plans, then the EPA has to review it, and then you're talking about 2018 or so before a company like American Electric Power says, here's what it needs to do as part of its compliance with 111D. How much work do you think we can get done between 2018 and 2020? It takes about 5 years to build a power plant. It takes that long or longer to build a transmission line. So really the only compliance option you have in that time frame is to retire something. Okay. So the bottom line is we think that we're going to wind up with higher electricity costs. And how much higher? NEAR estimates, they're a consulting firm, right? They run their models too, and it's kind of the dueling models, but they're estimating $366 billion in cost. And really you're talking about double-digit rate hikes in pretty much every state, just associated with 111D. And 111D is just one line in that first slide we looked at of all those environmental regulations. Okay, reliability impacts. Here's something that I think has really not gotten the attention that it absolutely deserves. So 73 gigawatts is our time between now and 2020 due to the existing environmental regulations. 73 gigawatts. Another 50 gigawatts are going to be shut down as a result of 111D. So now you're talking about 120 gigawatts of coal-fired generation, 60 million homes gone in 5 years. It took a lot longer than that to build those power plants. And those power plants were built, each of them, based on a review of demand, load, and supply. And we have been, as someone pointed out earlier, we haven't been building a whole lot of new generation lately. In fact, in states where utilities don't really have an obligation to serve, in deregulated states, where basically the market is responsible for serving the customer, there's almost no generation being built because of the uncertainty we're talking about. So I think it does raise serious concerns about the ability to maintain that grid and for us to be sure that when we go over and flip the switch, the light's going to come on. There are ways to do this that are lower cost and higher certainty, but this is a really, really complicated system. The nation's electric grid is one of the most complex pieces of machinery man has ever built. And yet we're going around and we're shutting things off on that grid without ever doing a comprehensive model to see will it stand on its own 2 feet. And in fact, so we've done some of those studies ourselves. We use the same models that the PJM uses, that the regional transmission operator uses, and we found literally thousands of overloads that would occur as a result of 111D, just based on what is already estimated, even in EPA's estimates of what power plants are going to get shut down. So you have significant reliability issues that are created when this load goes away in specific pockets, literally thousands of them, and between 2018 and 2020, you have to comply. There is no way to build enough transmission to mitigate those issues in that time frame. So really climate change, the big picture, right? It's really about this equation right here, and this is, I'm an engineer, so this is how I like to talk. The quality of life is a function of access to electricity. There's no two ways about that. Whether you're talking about lifespan, or you're talking about infant mortality, or access to clean drinking water, eating better, better educated, it really correlates very well to access of electricity. So when you think about that, and you think about the fact that, as someone talked about earlier, 31 gigawatt tons of CO2, 1.5 of that comes from the United States. If you believe World Magazine's coal estimate, and you could pick a different estimate, but the reality is that China and India will add substantial quantities of coal capacity in the coming years because they have a substantial portion of their population that don't have access to electricity. So if you're a policymaker in China, are you worried about climate change 30 years from now, or are you worried about infant mortality this year? And if you're worried about infant mortality this year, the fastest thing you can build is coal. So at this rate of growth, the question is, if we eliminated that 1.5 gigatons from U.S. sources, then how significant is that? And you can really see that that gap closes pretty quickly, so that by 2019, about the time this plan goes into effect, you would have already lost the benefit associated with the plan. But we'd still have the hundreds of billions of dollars worth of cost associated with the plan. And that's the bottom line. Okay. Coal will be part of the energy future. Okay. Gas will become a bigger part, renewables will become a bigger part, and we think that's absolutely appropriate. But even if the United States were to today do kind of what Germany did around nuclear and say, you know what, we're not going to do any more coal, or we're going to phase out coal, as we all know, CO2 emissions are a global issue, and climate change is a global issue, and China and India's coal use will continue to increase. And so the reality is that we're going to need to learn how to deal with CO2 emissions from coal plants, regardless of what the United States does. You can see technology has really helped. I talked earlier about reduction of NOx and SO2 emissions. You can see here are the numbers here across, I think these numbers are actually nationally. And then you can see coal, even though coal has increased, we've still been able to reduce those emissions. And this is kind of an eye strain chart, but someone spoke to it earlier. There is a significant technology pathline that will take you to low CO2. You go through ultra supercritical technologies, and quite frankly, we have supercritical coal plants now, and I can tell you based on the EPA regulations, those plants are threatened because you're wondering, you know, if I have to invest $1 billion in a scrubber, and it's going to take me 30 years to recoup that investment, it's going to take my customers 30 years to basically swallow that investment, then what's CO2 regulation is going to look like 30 years from now? It's a very difficult equation that we all have to solve. But if you look at technology, you can go from ultra supercritical, and then you can go ultra supercritical with oxy combustion. You can start adding in, you can start adding in the amines, CCS, and then over time you're going to have to improve the efficiency of CCS to make it really cost effective. So I guess at the end of the day, what we're trying to say is that we really believe that a diverse portfolio and all of the above kind of solution is absolutely essential. I think we ought to set our public policy to establish all of the above. We need to make decisions appropriately. If you look at Germany, Germany kind of said, all right, that's it, we're going renewables, and they paid a heavy price for that. They are very proud of the fact that they have basically subsidized the solar market to the point where solar panel costs have come down a lot, and they do get credit for that. But the ratepayer is paying for that. And oh, by the way, in Germany, one of the reasons that that happens without crashing the economy is basically most of the industrial customers are held harmless from those additional surcharges for environmental. So really the residential customers pick it up, all of it. I don't think that would go over real well in this country. Okay. We think that each of these play a vital role in supporting it. We think energy efficiency is important. But the issue is not whether or not you should do energy efficiency or whether or not you should do renewables, but about achieving that balance and doing it in a very methodical, decision-based way over time so that we can minimize the cost and minimize the disruption to electric grid reliability. Thank you.
Oh, yes. Are there any questions for our speaker?
decline in CO2 that you showed, is that related to just a declining electricity market in general, or is it due to the efficiency?
For the reduction in CO2?
Yeah, that you showed.
So part of it is energy efficiency over time, part of it is economy that slows a little bit.
Yeah.
And part of it is shifting away slowly from coal to natural gas. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that there is a way, we've managed to reduce by 20%,
Right.
or whatever that number is, in a relatively short time frame without dramatically increasing the cost of electricity or threatening reliability. So why would we not look for policies that continue that?